So as I said, first of all, thanks for everyone joining us this morning, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you in different parts of the world. So thanks for joining us on this first session on irrigation as part of the Output-Based Aid webinar series. If you could let us know what location you are participating from, that would be excellent. So basically, the OBA webinar series aims to facilitate peer-to-peer exchange amongst people working in development, donors, governments, clients, and people interested in output-based aid and performance-based um, uh, developing partner sort of financing instruments, etc. So if you are new to the concept of output-based aid, please make sure to check us out on GPOBA.org, which is the website for the Global Partnership on Output-Based Aid. Now, in order to participate, you can type questions or comments during the presentation into the chat box located at the right of your screen, and we will make sure to address them during the Q&A session at the end. As this is a webinar series, only the presenters will be able to speak, so unfortunately we won't be able to hear from you, but please do type your questions into the box, and I will read out the questions to Jake, who will then answer your questions in turn. So let me introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Jake Burke. He's a lead irrigation specialist in the Water Global Practice at the World Bank. He has over 30 years of experience in irrigation and water resources management with engineering consultants, drilling contractors, the UN Secretariat, and the Food and Agricultural Organization. He has been involved in working areas of resource development and management with a host of countries across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. I won't list them because they're far too long. The list is far too long. So Jake has vast experience in the irrigation sector. Let me just explain what it is. Let me give you a few seconds overview of what output-based aid is. Output-based aid is essentially a performance-based subsidy that is used to extend basic infrastructure and social services to the poor. Typically, output-based aid is used to finance last-mile type investments. So we're not looking at funding big infrastructure here with output-based aid. We're either looking to support small systems, or we're looking to support extensions to larger systems so that the poor can also benefit from these basic services. The sectors where output-based aid has been tried and tested and yielded good results is the water and sanitation sector, the energy sector, health sector, and now we're also venturing, GPOBA is venturing into newer areas such as urban solid waste management. We're looking at doing some more things in the education space, and as part of the mandate given by the donors, we're also exploring the use of output-based aid in irrigation. So in order to further this work, we commissioned a study to look at the applicability of output-based aid as a results-based financing instrument for supporting investments to help poor farmers in the irrigation sector. So Jake is going to take us through this presentation, which will discuss, in particular, the role of output-based aid in supporting investments by poor farmers in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So you will hear about opportunities and potential risks for OBA interventions, and we're going to draw on specific examples from India and Zambia. So please, once again, feel free to type your questions as we go along, and then we'll take the questions at the end of the short presentation. So Jake, over to you.
Yes, and greetings to everyone. So once any farmer applies water to irrigate, everything changes. From inputs, that's the seed, the fertilizer, the pest management, to post-harvest marketing, to income generation. So for all types of farming, and irrigation is really the ultimate form of precision agriculture. But for smallholders in particular, access to reliable irrigation services within existing schemes or as standalone private initiatives, financing the basic infrastructure against revenue from future production presents a challenge. Some governments subsidize irrigation equipment, but many do not, and particularly in countries where irrigation adoption rates may be low, even if the demand for irrigated production is high. And as Rajesh has explained, with these considerations in mind, GPOBA undertook a baseline study to examine the financing options from an OBA perspective. Prior to this study, reviews of results-based financing in water identified OBA as potentially suitable for building and operating individual irrigation systems, connection to a larger public or private system, such as outgrowers, and the maintenance of drainage systems. But understanding a results chain and being able to distinguish between inputs, outputs, and results is important for water services, and particularly so for any application in agricultural water management. The water service is the lead input, but it is only one of many that eventually create income. The objectives of the study and its country focus. Well, the study was undertaken by a consortium of Cambridge Economic Policy Associates and Euroconsult Mott MacDonald. And the Asia test areas where smallholder irrigation has been a subsidy target were examined. And here we're looking for the scope for more structured promotion of public subsidy and private risk sharing. The Africa focus looked at countries where promotion of more productive smallholders had been a stated policy objective, but against a background of more variable policy and incentives. However, the main assumption in both is that the irrigation can produce income in addition to satisfying household subsistence. And in addition to the case studies, more detailed in-country work was done in India and Zambia, and that is broadly what I'll present this morning. Just a refresher on the report outputs, which I gather will be made available after this webinar. I hope they're self-explanatory. There was a main report, but a set of important annexes. A financial model user guide, a review of the OBA approach and case studies in relation to small-scale irrigation, and country studies from a desk-based review. And generally, the scope to apply OBA in the irrigation sector was evaluated against sector fit. And here we're looking for general policy environment and consistency with OBA principles. And that brought out a couple of concerns, particularly if the bureaucracy was overcomplicated, particularly with subsidy administration, and the pre-financing by the service provider. Monitoring and evaluation implementation. Well, some irrigation projects have employed third parties to verify outputs. That was the case for Jain irrigation in Karnataka, for instance. But again, a set of concerns arose: capacity of governments and government administration, water user associations, and their ability to manage an OBA contract. I mean, the scope for subsidies and grants appears to be there, and the demand is evident. And this intervention is designed really to be a step-up approach, transitioning from one type of farming to a more precise irrigated agriculture system, with some step changes also in the income generation. One of the concerns, though, is that it's potentially difficult to measure the delivery of an irrigation service and the outcome of an irrigation service in a simple IVA independent verification agent. So finally, the financial sustainability of the sector was another area that was looked at in detail, and although it may be possible to levy irrigation service charges, typically these may be set too low to cover the operation and maintenance costs, and there may be problems with collection. The overall assessment was generally positive, but it will only work if put in conjunction with other on-farm investments and extension support. And I think that's an important point to stress. In addition, the independently verifiable output is not just the delivery of a water service, and this is unlike water supply and sanitation or energy utilities, where you're really just trying to get the performance at the point of consumption. And I think that whether or not the irrigation, the application of the OBA boosts the productivity and income is one thing that is quite difficult to track as a one-off assessment. So the other point was that the technology application and producer price margins in irrigated crops need to be clear from the outset. If there's vagueness there, often we won't see success. If we look at the assessment of project opportunities in India and Zambia, in India, the use of market-based approaches was examined, together with integrated micro-irrigation projects and rainwater harvesting tanks. In Zambia, a specific commercial hub and outgrow model was examined. And obviously, whilst there's a wealth of research in both India and sub-Saharan Africa on smallholder opportunities linked to agricultural water management, the trick is finding an OBA model that is robust enough to take to scale. And for an OBA project, we would want the solutions to be market-driven and not wedded to any particular technology. The technology choice should really be left to the farmer and the service provider to work on within the subsidy that they have available. And here, the role of demonstration farms operating a range of irrigation equipment on locally adapted crop varieties can be important. So then after on these more detailed reviews in India and Zambia, what were the results? Well, at the very low level of technology, using treadle-based punt, subsidies for treadle-based punt systems, with IDE India, a scheme was discussed, and it was assessed that a funding gap of approximately $75 per farmer could be a potential target for an OBA subsidy. But the assumptions are that the costs borne by the farmers are in the order of $50 against that $75 funding gap. But again, it assumes a very low level of pump technology and use of pre-punched Pepsi tape. And it assumes that also shallow groundwater or drainage is accessible. But in that case, the key for an OBA dealer approach is getting a low-cost standard adopted and not proliferating the market with boutique solutions. And we should bear in mind that everybody is trying to do this. There's the KB drip systems as well as the Jane irrigation systems. But the marketing of the technology application is sometimes confused. And I think those diagrams and photographs just show what the potential for confusion is over the technology. Scaling up to hectare-based plots with more elaborate micro-irrigation technology, the funding gap increases significantly and relies on a level of state government subsidy that may vary. Here there are more elements and triggers to track and together with the farm household and with modest farmer income increases. But coordination and verification of all the flows and the results becomes more complex. Venturing into small tank country and linking up with NGO support to pre-finance was also examined. One of the issues that came up here is that, that the land required to construct tanks has to be given up by someone, and that may be a barrier to entry. But as you can see, the funding gap is also relatively high, even if the incomes start to improve significantly. And it should be borne in mind that it's quite difficult to verify these outputs, because if you take the case, for instance, of a small tank in Andhra Pradesh, thousands of tanks are scattered across southern Andhra Pradesh, serving small command areas. But if you look in detail, they are generally peppered with boreholes and submersible pumps. And so, in that sense, some tank development may not be so clean or verifiable, since the resulting irrigation service depends on conjunctive use. And these are the sorts of details to bear in mind when appraising the suitability. Let's now look at the Zambian in-country study, which took a very different approach, a commercial joint venture supporting outgrowers who would be linked to a joint venture offtake agreement with a sugar mill. Here the scope for OBA application was examined in more elaborate and almost turnkey operation. This model may not target the poorest farmers, and there are questions as to what the OBA subsidy should cover. Should it be just the irrigation equipment, or should there be an element of land preparation thrown in as well? So as these things become more complex, more contracts to supervise, the role of the independent verification becomes more complicated. And I think that's, if we can keep it neat and simple on the IVA, that as has been done for water supply and sanitation, then the transaction costs there for the administration of the subsidy will obviously be kept to a minimum. Once you start increasing supervision of contracts and performance of contracts, that IVA becomes much more difficult to administrate, and to make sure that you've got the professionals who can do it well. So, as a general point, there are two areas where the literature on the uptake of irrigation by small-scale farmers is weak. First is the linkage with a viable crop model. Can the quantity and quality of irrigated production be sold at acceptable margins? And second is the choice of irrigation technology in relation to the crop model. These are particularly important for this potential application of OBA and the prospects for taking it to scale. Clearly, the technology choice should be straightforward. The national standards are preferable. Quality assurance has to be part of the provision, and making sure that there's enough service and spare parts provision, which may include extension, that may depend upon the market being large enough. And as I've pointed to before, how to keep it simple for the IVA, I think that's very important. It's more than just verification of a functioning tap or a water meter, and it may require more than a one-off inspection. So for general conclusions, I think the market-based approaches for a range of technologies, including rainwater harvest tanks, are potentially good candidates. You can start to reach a large number of small farmers in marginal agricultural areas with low incomes. It's less complex to implement, and generally private service providers may be more agile than local government agencies. However, there is a need to assess the appetite that the private sector has for pre-financing, and also to be able to monitor long-term improvements in land productivity. The opportunities to address larger scale interventions would need to be structured carefully. Even with more complex micro-irrigation setups, there are bureaucratic complexities working with state governments, and there's also a limited time frame for the OBA intervention, which may work against the way in which the irrigated subsector is transitioning. For commercial hub grower outgrower models, although they offer another opportunity, the funding gap is large, and the incentives for larger scale farmers to continue ongoing provision of irrigation services to smallholders has to be examined closely. So for the next steps, we hope that there will be a deep dive analysis of some specific project opportunities. Certainly further analysis of the risk appetite with private sector providers, and we anticipate scope for project funding over a 3 to 5 year timeline. But we might have to go to a longer time frame simply to if we were to take heed of the conclusions raised in the consultants' reports. Finally, we'll develop a concept note for OBA financing for the most viable opportunities, and where we have a good overall sector fit and strong demand. And that will be dependent upon changing opportunities in countries, and also the funding line that can be generated through OBA. So with that explanation, I hope that all the details have been clear enough. Please don't hesitate to come back with comments your comments for any elaboration or clarification. And with that, I'll hand you back to the moderator, Rajesh. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jake, for the quick overview. If people have questions, I'd appreciate if you could type them into the box on the right of your screen, and then we'll choose the questions from there, and we'll have Jake take them one by one. So please feel free to go ahead and type your questions in here.
Okay, I think
We have a question from Yogita here. I know Yogita is very familiar with output-based aid, having worked with GPOBA for a number of years. So I think it's a very good question. It's what is, in the examples that have been described here is what is the output? What are we trying to maximize? Is it water use, water efficiency, and what is in the subsidy, and how is it a sustainable subsidy? Given that water is probably severely underpriced, and what we want is to make sure users are being efficient with this scarce resource, how do the intended approaches plan to tie into this? So, over to you, Jake.
yes, I think this is one thing that troubled me because right from the start, because having seen how OBA has been applied in water supply and sanitation services, for example, it's very clear that once you have achieved the delivery of a certain volume of water at a certain quality to a point of consumption, to a tap, then in a way that's the end of the story. There's a whole hygiene story downstream of that. But this is not the case in agriculture, because the water may just be the lead input, and so that's what's being provided by the OBA subsidy. But in fact, the result at the end of all that is increased income, and that depends upon a whole chain of production chain and marketing chain. Assumes that producer prices are acceptable and that a return for the investment by the farmer and together with the OBA subsidy is of a sufficient level to keep that the system in production and to keep income at as I say, at acceptable levels. Now, whether or not it's to do with the efficiency argument in small-scale settings, shallow groundwater or scavenging drainage, that may not be so much of an issue. Certainly, if most of these sources are largely self-supplied, then there's the issue of just who do you have any water charges to they applied, and is water in that case underpriced or not? I think that would only apply on larger schemes where you've got connection with the Water User Association that has to levy prices. But clearly, most of these small-scale initiatives are going to be fairly atomistic, as Tushar Shah would say, and that the benefits will be captured by the farmer in most cases. So I think that's one thing that which careful attention needs to be paid to right at the outset, to make sure that you're measuring something that is both independently verifiable by a third party and is an indicator of improved production and with that increased income.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Beju Vaidya, which is asking, can you go through a couple of other financing mechanisms that could be used to fund projects of this nature, and briefly what are the benefits and limitations? And I think just to sort of stress the point here that we're looking at the use of output-based aid, and how output-based aid works is that the service provider pre-finances the inputs that are required to achieve a desired output, which is as close as possible to the desired outcome, which in this case would be improvement in agricultural productivity. And then the subsidy is paid after the fact, and that fact has to be verified by an independent verification agent, which is showed up as an IVA on the diagrams. So what we have here is significant risk transfer, and in structuring the OBA subsidy in this kind of an arrangement, really, one of the big considerations was how do we make sure that there is enough risk appetite in the project or with the service provider for them to be able to actually invest their own resources, given the risk that the output-based aid subsidy will be paid only if the outputs are achieved. So Jake, if you have some other thoughts on what other financing mechanisms to be used, that's great.
Yes, I was going to say that, I mean, term finance in agriculture and small-scale agriculture has always been a problem. I mean, trying to select appropriate and structure appropriate rural credit models is a constant headache. And I think we've seen successes and failures in these in the past. Microfinance also comes into to mind as well. But I think we should bear in mind that as you scale up your irrigation system, it's like, it becomes like a farm asset. It's like a tractor or any other piece of mechanization. You're going to require term finance for that. You're unlikely to be able to recoup the costs of that investment in one or two seasons, although that has been done in some, I know places in Gujarat where that's happened with drip. So I think the OBA intervention should be seen as a very specific way to try and accelerate adoption where perhaps rural credit models in the past have been sluggish or not adaptive or agile enough. And I think that's where the innovation should be, together with trying to get the private sector particularly to take on some risk, as Rajesh was explaining. So I hope that answers the questions there. There are pros and cons to all these finance mechanisms, but certainly with OBA, it's trying to cut through to just fund that critical gap between what the farmer is likely to be able to afford and the actual cost of the infrastructure.
Excellent. I think that takes us that's a good intro into the next question, which is really around the outputs. And if you could probably sort of run through to answer Peggy's question about outputs as to what are the considerations in terms of what are the outputs that we'll be looking at for an irrigation project, and what are some of the verification methods that would work in this area. And I guess this also links in with Yogita's point about sustainability, and I think we had a good back and forth with the consultants about what we would pay against, as in not just paying against the water connection, but what other outputs. So perhaps you could discuss that. And then there was also a good question about local governments here. Marco Aguero is asking, is it just with central governments, or are we working with local governments, and I guess also private sector?
Okay. I think if I've shown the India integrated micro irrigation project diagram on the screen there, just to indicate first that you've got, for any verification, you've actually got quite a complex process, and it may not just be a one-off visit at the end of the installation to see that a pipe and a meter is functioning. And it's a big question. It's just how much can you verify? Can you afford to verify? And at what point? Because as these systems build up, as hopefully the land becomes more productive, incomes improve, and so on, that's a progressive output. It's not restricted to just a one-off supply. And I think that's a particular challenge, and I think I highlighted that right at the beginning of the presentation. Please bear those points in mind. Trying to find a smart indicator amongst all that is quite tricky. And then if you look at the Zambia case in particular, here with a joint venture administering part of the service to the farmers, taking on some of the risk, it linked with an off-take agreement with a sugar mill. All these things can change and may need to be verified, not just on a one-off basis, but also as the scheme develops. So I just highlight that warning, and so long as everybody's aware of it right at the beginning and can try to pick out smart indicators, perhaps those transaction costs can be kept to a minimum. On the second question of the role of local governments, well, yes, in the case of extension services, for instance, to irrigation, smallholder irrigators, then that may be a critical addition to the generation of the benefits, together with their overall local government responsibilities in administering and zoning land use and so on. So I would say that they would have, by default, to play an important role, but they may not necessarily be taking the risk. And I think that's an important point. If it's not a government subsidy that is being channeled through perhaps an overly bureaucratic administration system, although we know these things are getting speedier and leaner as use of smartphones and things like that comes into play, then it is assumed that the private sector or the NGOs could be more agile. Again, you have to check that. You have to check that the NGOs are competent and can and you choose them with care. What you want from the central government is an overall operating environment in which these things can open up and finance can flow.
I mean, that really sort of stresses the point that OBA is a financing system that's really developed, that's really implemented at service provider level rather than central government level. So I think that's the case with all of our projects. So whether that service provider involves an NGO, as Jake said, or the private sector or local governments, we'd be happy to work with any of those parties. And the other thing I wanted to just say was that part of the reason of having the webinar is to kind of gauge interest around within the bank and beyond as to what sort of appetite there is to actually do an OBA pilot. I mean, that's our intention. The next steps that Jake pointed out at the end of the presentation were to do a deep dive analysis on actually structuring a project. There are lots of questions about how it would be structured, how it would look, but I think one of the best ways is to find a suitable environment and then go ahead and actually try out an OBA subsidy. So if any of you have project ideas that you would like to discuss further, please feel free to contact us after the webinar. Please feel free to download the report and read through what the structure of an OBA project would look like in the irrigation sector. And the other couple of questions we have here, one is on the mitigation of risk of the private sector not continuing to support the strategy once OBA is closed. I mean, again, this links to the sustainability. So Jake, if you could perhaps just touch on that, and then we'll take Inga's question next.
Okay. Yes, I think what I tried to point out, I think in the last slide, in the issues slide, was this: how to keep things scaled, long-term provision of spare parts and other services, which could include extension, advice, and so on. And here, you want to make sure that the market is going to be large enough for that to happen. And generally, my sense is that that works if there are good standards, good quality insurance in place, so that there are not, let's say, there's not a proliferation of boutique solutions, but you've got good, robust technology that can be scaled, and which present a large enough market for service providers to maintain spare parts provision and so on. And the idea is that once the step up with the OBA intervention has happened, the platform for that that scaling should be in place, so that the thing doesn't contract as soon as the OBA subsidy ceases. And I think in a way that goes back also to a policy question for governments as to making sure that they can allow private sector providers enough room to maneuver with clear understanding of those any national standards, quality control on equipment. You know, there are grey imports of plastic and emitters and so on, which may work well enough, but equally a lot of plastic can be dumped on markets, and it's important to make sure that there is some overall quality assurance to keep the thing flowing again, make sure that farmers just don't abandon the technology. So I think with all that, yeah, sorry, Rajesh, go ahead.
Sorry, I finished. What I was saying is that with all, one of the fundamental principles of OBA is that the users that benefit from the subsidy should be able to continue enjoying the service over a longer period. So they should be able to generate or have enough income or generate enough revenue to be able to pay the ongoing O&M costs. So that's certainly the case in the water and sanitation sector and the energy sector. So we would expect to see a similar case in the irrigation sector, which links in with what Jake said about the private sector continuing to service and provide services at a profit to the beneficiaries over the longer term. The next question we have from Inga is on water as a scarce resource. We're increasingly working in environments with scarce water resources, which raises a host of risks from sustainability of the water source through the political risk. And how does this factor into irrigation projects where the incentive is for the service provider to implement as much as possible, and I guess that means use more water to generate more outputs? Jake, could you say something on that?
Yes, I think, obviously when scarcity is a limit, then there is generally, and rain-fed agriculture becomes intolerable, then you will find there's a drip, conversion to more precision irrigation using drip. As these are the things that have been examined by in the report, particularly the application of plastic, emitters and drippers and so on. Clearly with that water use efficiency in mind. But obviously there's a potential contradiction there if this promotes expansion of irrigated area and increased ET. Because obviously these things are not negotiable. As soon as you start increasing the area, then your consumption will go up, even if you're applying precision irrigation through drip and so on. Now, if you're scavenging shallow groundwater circulation or tank drainage, then arguably the damage has already been done, and the allocations to irrigation have already been made, and there's little scope for improving that other than leaving it alone. So I think even though there is a political risk there, that's a planning thing that has to be sorted out at basin level. And if you were to take the case of peninsular India, the place is already littered with tanks that have been there sometimes for centuries. But obviously, a lot of those the resources are not getting all the way through the system, and it almost becomes a culture of use it before you lose it in the headwaters. So that's something that would need to be regulated at basin level, and the only provision that the OBA intervention would have would be to try and insist on adoption of standards and practices that conserve as much water as possible, given the availability. So I think that's, to me, it shouldn't be so much of, that's more of a planning issue rather than an implementation one, because I think that the systems that have been used are generally realizing that there are scarce resources and that they have to be managed as well as they possibly can with good practice, with good technology. And that's part of the conditionality of the subsidy, to make sure that both the technology and the practices are put into place.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent. If you see what's happening in a lot of these developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, they're using flood irrigation systems. So if we're bringing in an output-based aid subsidy to help employ the use of water-efficient technologies, as Jake pointed out, then hopefully we're helping address the water scarcity issue. Interestingly, even in the US, Jake's group had organized a very interesting BBL that brought somebody from the United States Department of Agriculture in. And even in the US, where there's huge commercial agriculture taking place, there's no charge for the actual withdrawal of the water resource and use of the resource. What the farmer pays for is to access the resource and whatever infrastructure they put in place to get the water to their farm. And once they have it there, it's basically available for them in as abundant quantities as they like. I think we don't seem to have any more questions.
Only to say that it would be early days. I mean, it's been looked at, as I say, reviews that we carried out with the Water Partnership Programme and OBA on results-based financing in water generally pointed at irrigation. This was something that was being taken up now by OBA and by its expert panel, something they wanted to look at. And we'll go ahead and try to structure some projects where the environments and the settings are conducive. But I think even with the caveat about the problems of verification, the idea is to try and to plug a certain gap. There is still a last mile gap where smallholders are not connected to enough technology or extension service to do the step up, and if OBA can be used in that smart way to try and identify those critical gaps in particular settings with particular crops, then I think that there will be some scope for its successful application. But it should leave a legacy too, and I think we've all seen many smallholder initiatives die or just fail through indifference, lack of interest. Hopefully the incentive structures are a little clearer in this case, and it will be able to promote more demand pull than supply push. So that's the overall hope. The concept notes will be developed over the next financial year, we hope, and with that we'll try and consolidate all the findings we've had to date, but also the comments that have come back from yourselves today. Many thanks.
Thank you, Jake. And we really hope that this webinar has stimulated some thinking about the applicability and possible use of output-based aid in the irrigation sector. And we look forward to hearing from you in terms of whether you have any project ideas or you'd like any more information, or just to have a general discussion about whether you would like to consider using output-based aid in any of your projects. Our target areas are really Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar session, A recording and the presentation will be available on the webinar webpage of the GPOBA website. The report that this presentation is based upon will also be available on the website. The next webinar GPOBA will host was going to be on the subject of municipal solid waste. So if for those of you who are interested in that subject, it would be great if you could attend that as well. And just before you leave, we'd really appreciate it if you could complete the feedback survey before you leave the webinar. It's a very short survey up here. Just if you could answer the questions, that really helps us in improving the next series, in improving the webinar series and checking on the quality control aspects. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and hope to see you again at one of our other sessions in the future.